What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're going to be talking about the spiky boys of the 41st millennium. We're talking about some Chaos Space Marines, and this isn't any Death Guard or Thousand Suns or these new brand spanking shiny new Chaos Legions that are getting gorgeous new codexes with tons of special rules and really powerful profiles. We are talking about pure Codex Chaos Space Marine Heretic Astartes today, although a little bit of Imperial Armor Compendium shoved in there. I mean, you kind of gotta right now these days. But this is because Russell Tassin, taking a pure Black Legion army, not even Emperor's Children or one of the other very popular Chaos Space Marine Legions, just took down the Warzone Houston GT this past weekend with a super cool list over 9 games of 40k, going 8-1 at the end of the day. So today, let's cover this Black Legion list, what's in it, how it works, and what it faced off against this weekend. So yeah, sit back, grab yourself a little snack, subscribe to the channel, maybe drop one of them likes and stuff, and let's talk about some Chaos Space Marines. Now, first off, we'll talk about the Warzone Houston GT itself, and I will preface this by saying that there is some weirdness with this event. It was a very kind of non-standard format. It had what looks to be a couple no-shows on its roster, and there were a lot of drops from the event before it even started. It ended up having 26 tables at the start for a total of 52 players. Still very respectable for a GT, but it does look like the organizers were pushing for more people and ended up attritioning a bunch on the lead up to the event. It also ran 9 rounds with 2 days of 3 rounds apiece for a total of 6 games into a top cut of the top 8, which all played each other over 3 additional rounds, meaning that only those top 8 players got to play the final 3 games of the event. This did lead to some interesting win-loss ratios at the very end, with obviously the number 1 player having a loss on his record in round 5, but obviously with that top cut, that does mean that that loss earlier doesn't necessarily take you out of contention for the win. I do like top cut style events, but only if you have the amount of time required to actually play them all the way through, as this event evidently did, running a full 3 days. Overall, we saw a wide variety of factions represented, with a little bit of an overrepresentation of orcs. We saw a lot of Drukhari, which is to be expected, as well as a lot of Space Marines, which makes sense as well. Not so many Adeptus Mechanicus this time around, which is, I think, one of the reasons that an interesting list like this Chaos Space Marine list could take the entire event down. And speaking of that list, let's get into it. This is Russell Tassin's Black Legion list, and it is an absolute doozy. It's starting off with a battalion detachment out of Black Legion. That's being led by who else than Abaddon the Despoiler? I mean, if you're bringing Black Legion, like, you gotta bring this guy. He's basically the star of the show. We also have a very cute include, a Terminator Chaos Lord upgraded with Angel's Bane. That's a relic combi bolter that shoots at strength 5 AP2 for 2 damage, but upgrades itself to 3 damage if you fire at an Imperium unit. That means that this guy could potentially pound something for 12 damage, and he has the Mark of Slanesh, which I imagine is in there so that you can endless cacophony his 1 combi bolter shot if you really want to stick another 3 damage through onto an Imperium unit. Moving on, we have 3 units of Chaos Cultists, 2 of them with Flamers, and a couple different special weapons on the Cultist Champions mixed in there. Those are each just 10 Chaos Cultists apiece. However, the Elite slot in this detachment is where things get really interesting. The star of the show are 2 Chaos Contemptor Dreadnoughts. Now, before you turn off the video and flip your table because Volkite Contemptors are coming back, these guys don't have Volkites, everyone. They've got twin las cannons on them. That's right, we're going back to the heady days of early 9th edition, where quad las cannon contemptors with Cyclone missile launchers were ripping up the meta. And we're back! They're making a comeback. In this elite slot, we also have a Leviathan Dreadnought with twin Volkite calibers, 1 Storm Cannon, and 1 Gravflux Bombard, as well as 3 Hunter Killer missiles. That's another very interesting loadout. Gives you a little bit of shot volume with that Storm Cannon, but also the Gravflux Bombard at short range can deal a ridiculous amount of damage to heavily armored targets. Moving on, we also have a Decimator with 2 Soul Burner Petards. A lot of times we see these guys with the Crimson Crown combo out of Iron Warriors using Demonsmith plus the Crimson Crown to explode their Soul Burner Petards for a ridiculous amount of damage. But the Soul Burner, especially with reroll 1 so it doesn't wound itself too often with that Plasma Overcharge style ability that it has, is a really solid profile. Just plinking through mortal wounds onto whatever it's shooting on a 2+2 wound, which is very nice. We also have a Terrax patterned Termite with Volkite chargers on it. While this thing does a lot of damage itself, and for 190 points is a relatively difficult profile to kill, it's also in there to protect the Chaos Cultists in the list, and potentially give them the avenue to deep strike up the table by keeping it in reserve early. That's followed up with a Super Heavy Auxiliary detachment, these detachments being made way more relevant by GT 2021, now reducing the amount you have to spend on them from 3 CP by 2, as long as they share your Warlord's sub-faction. And this being a Black Legion detachment means that it is going to get that CP discount, and in that Super Heavy Auxiliary is a single Khorne Lord of Skulls. This is so many throwbacks in this list. I'm super psyched. The Khorne Lord of Skulls is a ridiculously powerful profile. It comes in with a really solid body with that 5+ Demonic Invulnerable save on top of Toughness 8 with 28 wounds to start, as well as the ubiquitous Infernal Regeneration that all of those demon engines have, allowing it to regenerate wounds automatically. This one's equipped with a Gore Storm Cannon for D6, Strength 10 at the top profile, AP2, 2 damage weapons. It has kind of a rudimentary version of Blast, which changes its type to 2d6 shots if it is attacking units with 10 or more models. As you can see, a lot better than Blast because it doesn't disallow the Khorne Lord of Skulls to fire into melee with it like a Blast weapon would, and it works on 10 or more models, not greater than 10 models like standard Blast would. So it's pretty good. Unfortunately, only an 18-inch range, but that's generally okay because it only costs 5 points. We also have a Hades Gatling Cannon on that guy for 12 shots at Strength 8 AP2 for 2 damage. Now, while the melee profile on this thing is nothing to shake a stick at, it is mostly kind of a big battleship that's going to roam around the table and fire all its guns and stuff, and get charges when it can. Pièce de résistance on this big dude is the Demon Forge stratagem, which you can use anytime it shoots or fights during your turn to give it full hit and wound rerolls with all of those attacks, meaning all of those D6, Strength 8 or 10, AP2, big damage attacks are all going to be shooting with full rerolls. Absolutely phenomenal amounts of damage coming out of this thing. Now we can make some insights about how this list was actually played, and that's because the YouTube channel Wargames Live actually streamed this entire tournament and streamed a ton of Russell's games. I want to throw a big shout out to Wargames Live. Their presentation over the course of the weekend was incredibly professional, and their setup was super good looking. So if you want to see some really high quality competitive 40k coverage, absolutely go check out that channel. I'll drop a link down in the description and in the pinned comment if you want to go check them out. It looks great. They're also going to be streaming one event every weekend for the next 2 months. So that's 8 consecutive GTs, I believe, which is an insane casting schedule, and I'm super excited to see more games from them. But that also means that we did get to see a lot of Russell's games because having a really interesting list that was piloted well means that he was on camera a lot. Generally speaking, the list used the bunker of the Dreadnoughts and Abaddon to give them full rerolls to deal lots of damage from a compact little footprint that's relatively easy to hide. With the Dreadnought sporting invulnerable saves in either damage reduction or healing on that Decimator, it's also relatively resilient to indirect fire, meaning a lot of the 2 or D3 damage shot that could potentially be coming at them while they're hiding out of line of sight aren't really going to be doing that much damage. You can then use them to peek around corners, get the shots that you need to, rip some stuff off the table very efficiently without exposing the core of your army. The units that moved out aggressively to grab objectives were those Chaos Cultists in addition to the Terrax Termite, which, being a resilient profile itself and being able to drop cultists onto the table after it's destroyed means that you can very safely hold an objective for multiple rounds, especially if your opponent has a tough time one-rounding it, which a lot of armies do. In a lot of Russell's games, this meant that the combination of those cultists and the assault drill could hold down one objective while the bunker of Dreadnoughts held down another one, and then the Khorne Lord of Skulls dominated a third, giving him good control over 3 objectives, which is enough to get you 10 or 15 points in most missions. Some canny use of the Tide of Traitors stratagem also allowed the cultist units to redeploy around the table to get Retrieve Octarius data or engage on all fronts when Russell needed to, and he also often used strategic reserves to hide the Khorne Lord of Skulls in matchups where it was potentially going to be taken out round 1 if it deployed out on the table. Now, before we move on, I do want to touch on this point real quick. While I don't have a Khorne Lord of Skulls in front of me, I do believe that based on the measurements given on the Games Workshop website, the Khorne Lord of Skulls is actually too large to be placed wholly within 6 inches of your battlefield edge when it comes into strategic reserve. It would end up sacrificing all of its actions for that turn, being unable to shoot or declare charges. This is because, based on the measurements on the Games Workshop website, the Khorne Lord of Skulls is 7 inches tall, and your battlefield is a 2-dimensional plane on which you play, meaning that the entirety of your model has has to start within 6 inches of that table edge. So you can imagine it as kind of a 6-inch tube, like a quarter pipe, basically, that you have to fit your entire model in from that line on the edge of the battlefield. And being 7 inches tall, a Lord of Skulls definitively cannot fit there, regardless of the orientation that you place it in. This isn't how it was played at this event, so I imagine it was a house rule. I'm not calling anybody out for rule breaking here, because I'm sure that Russell cleared it with the event organizers before he used that technology. I would just keep that in mind if you're trying to use it in your own games. And with that, let's move on to some of the opponents that this list played against. Now, 9 games in total were played, so I'm not going to go through every single game that this list played. I will gloss over the first 6 rounds momentarily before talking about the post-cut rounds in more detail. In round 1, the list played against Black Templars and was able to pull out a win 82-61. In round 2, against Ethan Farmer's Tout, was able to pull out a very close win 65-53. In round 3, it beat Brian Dickerson's Grey Knights 94-59, a resounding win. In round 4, we saw it play against the viewer of the channel, David Villarreal's Salamanders, winning 78-25. David did go on to make the top 8 cut, by the way, and continue to play on through round 7. It did get its first loss in round 5 against Nathan Fennell's Drukhari. Nathan also went in to play in the top 8 and get to the semifinal round before being knocked out. And Nathan did go first in this game, which is obviously a pretty big deal for Drukhari. Nathan was playing a very aggressive style of Drukhari that was predicated on mobility and pinning his opponent into their deployment zone with some very fast moving jet bikes and venoms on turn 1. And for a list as slow and vehicle oriented as Russell, that was still a very close game, 80-71. Then moving on to round 6, we saw Russell play against Jamie Pirazzolo, winning 77-58 against Jamie's melee style orcs. And that moved us on to the post-cut games, starting with round 7, in which Russell played against Nathaniel Bjorg's triple Telemon, triple Caladius Custodes list. Now, unfortunately, we played this on Vital Intel. I got on my soapbox in a recent video about how this mission isn't really competitively viable for Warhammer 40k, and I think this score is pretty emblematic of that. Russell did win this game 84-15, and I would hazard to guess that this is because Russell went first. If you're able to go first, especially with a piece like a Khorne Lord of Skulls that your opponent isn't really able to one round, especially a Custodes list, which isn't super duper high damaging at range, although having all those Caladi certainly helps. That means that Russell's able to put it on an objective, lock in that objective, and basically give himself easy primary points for the rest of the game, while his opponent has to move up into the teeth of Russell's threat range in order to score any points. While obviously we do see some close games in Vital Intelligence, the unfortunate fact is about half of them end with differentials like this, and that's just unfortunate. Not to take anything away from either of these players, that's unfortunately just the reality of 40k. Sometimes you hit a bad mission, and the roll to go first just wins the game, and that's all there is to it. Moving on, all of Russell's games were actually streamed for the remainder of the top 8 cut, so I'm going to be using some footage from those games to illustrate what I'm talking about in each of these matchups. Now, Russell actually played against Orcs both times in the semifinal and final games. Orcs becoming kind of a boogie alien in their own right in the metagame, with their Scrapjet and Wreck-A-Truck Squig Buggy spam lists being very scary, although not really putting up as hardcore results as we were expecting them to. In the semifinals, Russell played against Matt Tweedle's buggy-focused Orcs. This list focused on 2 units of 3 Megatruck Scrapjets, as well as 2 units of 3 Wreck-A-Truck Squig Buggies. Interestingly, there's also a unit of Mega Knobs in this list, which I absolutely love. This was played on Overrun, and in this game, Orcs went first, which is always pretty good on Overrun. As the first player, being able to knock out a lot of your opponent's objective holders early can be a big deal on Overrun, and being on long table edges, it has the shortest rush distance between the back edge of both players' deployment zone, meaning the relatively short range on those Wreck-A-Truck Squig Buggies isn't going to be as big a deal as it normally is. Now that said, we did talk about how resilient those Dreadnoughts are against a lot of indirect fire, and Wreck-A-Truck Squig Buggies are the perfect profile to not kill them very efficiently, firing only strength 5 attacks that wound on 5s and only being 2 damage, which means damage reduction hurts them a lot. With Orcs in the first seat, Russell actually only exposed his Leviathan Dreadnought, which was able to use Smokescreen to tank a bunch of stuff. In this game, he reserved the Khorne Lord of Skulls, like I mentioned before, and used the Hidden Contemptors and good line of sight to clear out the forward Orc units that were moving aggressively out of their deployment zone to engage that Leviathan. With the Dreadnoughts being able to tank a lot of that damage easily, Russell was able to shoot the Orcs off one of their objectives every turn, leaving them holding only 2, meaning that his Dreadnoughts, Terrax, Assault Drill, as well as the Khorne Lord of Skulls, once it reserved in on his center objective, were able to hold 3 objectives for a 3-2 lead every turn and slowly rack up 10 points to the Orcs' 5. While Russell played a phenomenal attrition game, peeling out as many Orc units as he could, he was able to build that lead into a convincing win by the end. I also want to shout out some good sportsmanship throughout this game, with Russell realizing that his Khorne Lord of Skulls could actually draw line of sight to some of his opponent's squig buggies, and him allowing his opponent to go back and reposition those squig buggies so he couldn't get line of sight to him, knowing that that was the intention of their positioning.
You can see that vehicle.
This one?
Yeah. Why don't you tuck him in, Matt? Tuck him in, because that's not what you wanted to do, right?
No.
Okay, that's your two. I know what you're trying to do, man. So yeah, just tuck him in.
There you go. That's a very sportsmanlike play there from Russell.
At the semifinals of a 9-round event, this is some phenomenal sportsmanship. It was really impressive to see and definitely paints Russell as kind of the good guy of the tournament. And that moves Russell on to face Colin McDade's Orc list in the finals of the event. Now this is a little bit more of a standard Orc list. It has a smattering of infantry, including 10 Gretchen, a couple units of Commandos, as well as 2 units of Storm Boys. But the heart of the list is 3 units of Megatrax Scrapjets, 1 of 3 and 2 individual Scrapjets, as well as 3 units of Squig Buggies, 2 individual Squig Buggies, as well as a unit of 2. That's followed up by a Wazbomb Blastajet, which is a profile that absolutely took me off guard from the new Orc Codex. It is an absolute anti-tank monster, and while all of those weapons are stapled to a relatively inconsistent Orc ballistic skill, although it does hit on 4s, which is pretty nice, and a very flimsy defensive profile, if this thing can get an Alpha Strike on something, it does an insane amount of damage. That's backed up by 3 Daka Jets and a couple of mech guns. Definitely kind of a standard archetype of Orcs, very focused on a huge ranged Alpha Strike. Now this round was played on Battle Lines, which in my opinion is a really good finals table mission. It's like super interesting and dynamic and forces aggressive play. I really like Battle Lines. I talked about it in my earlier video. It's one of my favorite missions. Given that both players had a very powerful ranged Alpha Strike, both of them spent a bunch of CP reserving their stuff, with Russell reserving his Terrax Assault Drill, as well as a couple of his infantry units, and the Khorne Lord of Skulls. The Orcs dropped down to a single CP, putting a lot of units in this teleporter, which allowed both players to kind of null deploy one another. Using his superior range on those las cannon-equipped Contemptor Dreadnoughts, Russell was able to deploy his fire base of Dreadnoughts and Abaddon in the very back edge of his deployment zone on his backline objective, well out of range of any of the Orcs shooting. That relatively low range in the Wreck-It Truck Squig Buggies ended up coming back to bite them because unfortunately they had to deploy so far back to get out of line of sight, so they weren't removed by las cannons immediately. They were going to have a difficult time getting anything to shoot over the first couple rounds of the game. This was compounded when the Orcs won the roll to go first and weren't really able to make any attacks on their first turn. This allowed the Chaos to basically do the same thing, hold themselves out of range of those Squig Buggies, and just wait for the reserves to start to come in. Colin elected to hold a lot of his reserves back on turn 2, not really bringing anything forward and essentially ceding control of the center of the table to his opponent. That allowed Russell to come in on turn 3 and bring in a lot of his reserves, including his Assault Drill in the center of the table and his Khorne Lord of Skulls up one table edge to hold down a side objective. In this case, the Khorne Lord of Skulls didn't do anything when it came in because Colin was able to hide his entire army that was on the table from its line of sight. That essentially gave Orcs the first opportunity to deal significant damage to their opponent, with all of the planes as well as a bunch of Scrapjets coming in to deal a bunch of damage with an Alpha Strike. This ripped a ton of wounds off the Khorne Lord of Skulls and started to ping wounds off the Dreadnoughts as well. The Khorne Lord of Skulls, I think, went down to 2 rounds of shooting, so it didn't really accomplish much in that game. However, what it meant was that Colin's units had to deep strike off of the center objectives because of the position of Russell's deep strikers. The only units that were really able to influence the center of the table, given how the Wreck-It Truck Squig Buggies were trying to keep out of line of sight, and a lot of the Scrapjets were either dead or had to reserve in inopportune areas far away from the objectives, the only Orc units in the middle of the table were aircraft, which obviously cannot control or contest objectives by themselves. That gave Russell the opportunity to trade his models for some really big victory point swings, scoring a couple of 10 and 15 victory point turns and knocking the Orc player down to 5 each turn. While Russell was losing models left and right to the incredible firepower of the Orc army, the Orcs weren't able to clear them off objectives fast enough, and Russell was able to use the bottom round 5 scoring, because he went second, to confirm the win at the end of the game. This was a super good game to watch. It featured both anti-gun line play, with both players being very cagey and making smart use of strategic reserves, alongside Russell using his threats to bully the Orc army off of objectives and trade his models for primary victory points, which ended up winning him the game and the tournament. Not only does it go to show you, I think, the interesting nature of battle lines, but also the interesting dynamic of those short table edge deployments, which give a long rush distance between the back edge of both deployment zones, and that relatively short indirect fire. Those Wrecker Truck Skrig Buggies, while they are very dangerous and can deal a ton of damage, aren't quite so dangerous if they can't reach the enemy objectives. That would force them to move out into line of sight and essentially remove any benefit that they have of having that indirect fire weapon, while those super long-range las cannons on all of the dreadnoughts are going to remove those units from the table extremely quickly. I think there's maybe something to be said for more short table edge deployments in the future, because those tend to have a pretty good first-second win-loss ratio. So with that, it left Russell undefeated with his Black Legion and the victor of the Warzone Houston GT. Pretty impressive stuff from a super off-the-wall list that was super interesting, and goes to show you that if you tech appropriately for the meta, also some really good and smart play, as well as using the custom rules of the event to your advantage, can definitely put you in a position to win, even with a more off-the-wall list like this Black Legion list. So anyway, that's all I have to say about that. Thanks for watching to the end of the video. I want to throw a big shout out to everyone who's helped support the channel over on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise. Also YouTube channel members and Twitch subscribers, all those people who help Tactical Tortoise keep on being tactical and a tortoise. And remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.